Welcome.
So as Liz mentioned, my name is Selma. I co-coordinate the Dawson Active Learning community along with Chris Whitaker, and I'm a SALTISE ally. And obviously I'm here with Liz and Michael Dugdale and Sue and Corey and all of you wonderful humans. Before we get started, I just want to let everyone know that the slides that you'll be seeing today will be sent to everyone at the end of the session, along with a survey. So you'll have access to all this valuable information, and we'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to fill out the survey and let us know how your SALTISE webinar experience went. So please join me in welcoming Dan Hickey. Dan is a professor at Indiana University, Bloomington, Learning Sciences program. He has a PhD in psychology from Vanderbilt University and postdoctoral fellowship from ETS Center for Performance Assessment. In his academic career spans 3 decades, starting in the 1990s. Since then, Dan has produced an impressive body of work with over 150 scholarly articles, including co-authoring with notables such as Jim Pellegrino, Susan Goldman, John Bransford, etc., as well as Quebec scholars like Thérèse Laferrière and Alain Breu. He has over 6,000 citations to his work. Welcome. His research focus are educational assessment, participatory learning, and design of innovative learning environments. He has worked on leading curricular innovations such as NASA's Exploring the Environment, MIT's Project New Media Literacy, and Indiana University's Quest Atlantis, to name a few. His experience with online teaching started in 2009 and been deeply involved in research of open badges and other forms of web-enabled credentials. His research has been supported by the MacArthur Foundation, the National Science Foundation, NSF, and the US Google, the US Department of Education, and others. His current research is supported by an NSF grant and combines a socio-constructivist innovation called playable case studies with the instruction and assessment strategies from his online instructions. We are also lucky to have a few doctoral advisees of Dan, Morgan Luo, and Trip Harris. I don't know if Trip is here. So thank you for accepting our invitation, Dan. We look forward to today's talk, the first of a 2-part webinar series on the challenge of assessment. So stay tuned for part 2 after this one. That's it.
Great. And I just want to pick up and maybe provide a bit of context that we've all been in together despite our different institutions. More than ever, I guess we're coming into this fall semester after having lived through a pretty incredible year together, and most of us have had to take our teaching practices quite suddenly online and face a whole new set of challenges. And so for better or worse, some of us were doing already a bunch of online learning and were engaged in different levels and kinds of online assessment before COVID. But found ourselves kind of thrust into it and going through this experience. And I don't know about all of you, but I've definitely learned a lot of things. A lot of these things that I've learned through SALTISE and our Dawson Active Learning community, things that I had to do as a mode of kind of survival of teaching online. But now that I'm, in my case, back in person with my students, there have been a lot of things that I've learned from that year online that I've been excited to kind of bring back with me. And so the invitation today, in talking to Daniel in a couple of meetings and reading some of his work, is to reimagine assessment, not just reimagine online assessment, but I think really to reimagine assessment and specifically how we can reimagine assessment through some kind of online frameworks, some frameworks for thinking about assessment online. So in my discussions with Dan and reading his work, there I guess I always look for the places where I start to get uncomfortable. And that's when I've learned that's where we should all lean in, is when we start to get uncomfortable. And where I got uncomfortable reading Dan's work and talking to Dan is when we start to look at how much time our assessment takes. And there are kind of three descriptors of assessment that I feel guilty of, that I'm bringing with me today to the seminar, which is that a lot of my assessment is individualized. I still do peer instruction, peer collaboration, peer assessment, but at the end of the day, when I think back on a semester, so much of my assessment is one-on-one assessment. Not only that, but it's private. So I'm giving students feedback one-on-one, and it's just for them. And the last part, which is the labor intensive, the amount of work that we spend grading and engaging in assessment. And so when in conversations, I hear things like, you might be wasting your time, or we might need to start thinking about how that kind of private individual feedback should become the lowest form of assessment in your toolbox. Yeah, that I'm leaning in, and I'm excited to kind of be challenged and pushed with some questions. So with that, I don't know if we could bring up our slides, because I'd like to share a bunch of questions that might also speak to you. I don't know if others here feel like they spend, they relate to me, and that I still spend quite a bit of time doing individualized private feedback that feels very, very labor intensive. We're going to talk about what effect that actually has on student learning, but I would also say what kind of impact it has on us as teachers when we talk about our own mental health and how we use our time. So do you want me to share the screen?
Yeah, yes, of course.
Yeah. I just wasn't sure who was going to do screen share. So
I also want to mention that my other doctoral student, Grant Chartrand, is with us as well.
Great. So sorry, this slide is just loading. So it's, oh, there we go. Perfect. Okay. Can you see the slide?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So your whole desktop.
Okay, that's not what I want. Sorry, I wasn't actually prepared. I'm actually gonna, here we go, there we go. Got it right here. So now you should see the slide. Context, why the focus on assessment. So here are a bunch of questions that we're inviting everyone here today to kind of think about, especially now that we're coming back into this, coming out of heavy intensive online assessment, to think about what are we going to bring back with us. So questions like, giving online assessments, did it frustrate you? Has it led you to question how you do assessment? Has it opened you up to some of the flaws or assumptions you have with traditional forms of assessments? Have you even started to notice some cultural biases in your assessments? Have you wanted to change your assessments but don't know really where to start? And the SALTISE question is, do you feel alone in this quest to kind of think about and change assessment? So this is in the context in which we're excited to have you with us today, and we're going to hand the floor over to you.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. I think we have a poll on the next slide, right?
Yes. So I'm going to ask Sue, I think it's going to help us take over this poll.
So I'll just, go ahead. There you go. Good. I'm just learning how to do these things, so. Note that there are 3 questions. You'll scroll down.
I'm going to stop sharing the screen because that way you can see the poll.
I wonder if anyone's ever used Mentimeter. Yeah, I was just at a presentation, and this woman who I've now gotten to be friends with just used it just brilliantly. It was so seamless, and it really. She said it was the first time she'd used it, so I'm going to look into that.
And while people are finishing the poll, I just want to go ahead and invite people to make use of the chat. As we go through today's session, we're going to be keeping an eye on questions that come up, and at different strategic points in the conversation, if you want to ask a question, we will find a place to intervene and ask your question for you.
I think the polling is pretty close to the end.
Yeah, 70% of the participants have. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay, so some people are saying more than half.
Daniel, please let me know when I can stop sharing the results.
Let's
of
see.
the poll.
So, and I guess everybody. Okay, so we got. So yeah, this is about what I would have expected. I will say, I'm definitely. I'm certain I'm less than 5%, as I'll show you. And I'm on number 2. Definitely no. As I'll show you, my goal is to spend almost all of my time engaged in public interaction with my students. And definitely, my answer to number 3 is also none, because I give so little private feedback. I know that my students spend a lot of time using my public feedback to learn. And then finally, and I definitely never spend more time giving private feedback. So there's some very oftens there. That's really, that's the thing that I'm really, really after is, I mean, it's really criminal to spend an hour giving feedback to a student who spends, who doesn't even use the feedback, but just wants to argue for more points. So that's precisely the kind of thing that I'm hoping we can address. So, okay, I think we can go on to the slides now.
And we have just to set the tone, we already have a few questions. I think they're just, as part of the context, so we don't necessarily need to address them right now, but it could be fun to,
Sure.
Bring people's questions in. So we got, I apologize if I say your name incorrectly, but Carolyn, who's asking, could we consider feedback an instructional activity and thus part of instructional time? With question 1, instructional time overall, or are we talking about specifically in the aspect of assessment? And does private feedback include at-home marking? I do that more than anything, so I don't spend one-on-one as instructional time.
At-home marking papers?
Yes.
Yeah, that I consider that a private interaction with a student.
Okay,
And
because the question was, how much, this was me.
Okay.
The question
Hi,
was
Nicola.
how much time do you spend as instructional time? And there's pretty much nothing, but I spend a lot of time marking papers. So
Yeah, I consider that part of your teaching load.
okay.
Yeah. So that's, I mean, what do you teach, Nicola?
English.
Oh my God. You teach composition?
Yes.
Uh,
And we have a lot of
you guys
second
are-
language students.
You guys are famous for your bundles of papers. I guess you probably do it electronically now.
You know
but-
what? I started during the pandemic. I use this now.
Okay, awesome.
But
Well, if we
yeah,
have
I used to
time
have
later,
files.
I'm a huge fan of social annotation. And that's one of the ways that I get around this, is that all of the students, when they're writing in public, and all of my feedback to my students. So right now I'm teaching a course, a different course that Morgan is in, where I'm teaching them to write a literature review. You know, the nuances of APA referencing. And we just this week really got into the trenches of, you know, what's the difference between EGIE and CF? How do you cite an empirical study versus a theoretical paper? These things that, and so I'm giving immense amounts of feedback on their writing, but it all is occurring on public Google Docs. And and everybody's looking at each other's work. And then at the end of the week, at the end of the assignment, I assemble, because I don't spend any time grading this week, I spent 6 hours going over each of them, where I instructed to identify the most appropriate and the least appropriate reference to the assigned reading. And then I was able to spend about 6 hours going through and assembling those into an announcement. And now the students can go in, after comparing them, their own 3, now they're being asked to vote on which is the most appropriate and the least appropriate reference to Glaser 1984 of all of the ones people found. And it's really uncovering these subtle nuances of what's the most appropriate. Like, what's the one claim that if you were to make in your paper and you didn't cite Glaser 1984, it would be an omission, and that a knowledgeable reader would recognize that as an obvious flaw. So that took me about 6 hours to assemble that, but I had that time because I didn't spend any time grading, giving private formative feedback and assessment. So great clarification. Any other questions or clarifications before we move on? Okay, you want to go ahead and put this shared slides back up?
Yes, sorry. Are we staying with our slides, or are you going into?
Yeah,
your
I think we were going to go through. My intention was to go through all the way through those, and then I'll switch over and share my screen.
Okay, sorry.
I apologize for not being clear about that.
No, it's fine, and I wasn't ready for being the slide sharer here. I might ask one of my colleagues who has the slides up. Here we go. Okay, I'm ready. I just had the chat window.
And I would like to add, this is based on Tripp is with us. Tripp was the co-author on this paper that appeared in Distance Education. Okay, so the next slide. So this is the latest version of this thing. These 4 levels of assessment actually emerged in work that I did while I was a postdoc at Educational Testing Service. I had studied with Jim Pellegrino and John Bransford, and I got a really solid grounding in a really sort of cognitive science with a really strongly constructivist orientation. I did my dissertation on the adventure of Jasper Woodbury. And something that happened at that time really shaped shook me to the core. And that is that in my dissertation, I found that Bransford's, the Learning Technology Center's Adventures of Jasper Woodbury, I did this beautiful natural experiment. I had 2 experimental and 2 comparison schools, and I found they were very nicely matched. And I found for the subset of teachers whose practice was consistent with the NCTM standards, Jasper had a massive impact on their achievement test scores. We're talking 23 percentage points higher on the problem-solving subtest of the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. That's a huge, huge impact for a relatively short-term intervention. And Bransford just didn't give a damn. He just was not impressed. And when I took that work with me and was working on it and writing it up while I was at ETS Center for Performance Assessment, something sort of fundamental happened to me. And that is Joyce Moore, who was one of Jim Greeno's students, handed me the chapter on transfer that she had written with Greeno in '93 and said, "You're not getting the whole picture on situated cognition. Jasper Woodbury isn't situated cognition. Jasper Woodbury is socio-constructivism." And she was a good friend, and I really trusted her. And during that time, 95 to 97, collaborating with Paul Horowitz, with a brilliant constructivist, really constructionist innovation known as GenScope, an amazing tool for letting kids explore genetics. I came to appreciate that Joyce was absolutely right, and that there was a bunch of stuff about situated cognition that I hadn't learned. And I came to appreciate, in particular, that situative theories of transfer really helped me appreciate why, after a month of amazingly engaged play with GenScope, students couldn't solve anything that resembled a conventional genetics problem. I mean, they couldn't solve anything. They didn't learn the Punnett square. And they sure couldn't solve sex-linked inheritance problems. We were hired to create a very sophisticated performance assessment. And Paul Horwitz said, oh, it's too far transfer. So I recreated our performance assessment using GenScope screenshots, and the kids only did a tiny bit better. And Paul said, Uncle, you're right. He thought they were going to do great. And that's when I really got immersed in formative assessment and really began, and this is published in AERJ in 2003. We created feedback conversations. We gave them these problems with familiar screenshots and said, if these two dragons have a baby, will it breathe fire? Yes, no, maybe, why? And they felt like they could answer it, but they couldn't, because in Greeno's language, they had been being attuned to the variant properties of GenScope. They knew that there was something about gender that impacted whether or not a dragon offspring breathed fire. So they were being attuned to that, but they were not being attuned to the invariant properties of the environment, how sex-linked inheritance works in all organisms. And so over several years, we really refined this formative assessment strategy, where these students, mostly inner city kids, would use these rubrics to discuss. So we really ratcheted up the formative assessment. And I really felt at that time that Greeno's ideas and arguments helped me appreciate that our job in those conversations was helping students become attuned to the invariant properties of the constructionist environment, and that formative assessment was a great way to make that happen. Worked with that for 10 years. And ultimately, though, one thing I came to realize, though, is our feedback conversations were teaching to the test. We were teaching them how to solve the problems on the performance assessment. So the fact that we were able to get a 3 standard deviation gain on a very sophisticated performance assessment was indeed an impressive gain. But we knew, and Sam Messick was at ETS at the time. I had the pleasure of knowing him before he passed, the godfather of validity, explained to me and everybody else in 1995 that what the rest of the world calls teaching to the test, he calls construct irrelevant easiness. Right? The construct is understanding of genetics. And if we're teaching students how to solve these problems, and so in the third of the 3 NSF grants, we bracketed our GenScope innovation with items selected randomly from the ETS subject test in biology that covered genetics. And so we're able to show that we're getting these massive, by the end of our work, 2 standard deviation gains on our performance assessments. We were getting a smaller, but a statistically significant gain on the SAT2 items compared to students in a traditional biology class who were really being prepared directly for that test. So ultimately, the work that we published on GenScope was this multi-level assessment. So there's these 4 levels of assessment: immediate, close, proximal, and distal. There's a lot of different variations of this. Sometimes I use 3, sometimes I don't have the 4th level of a distal test. The bottom line here is that what I'm going to recommend, if you're thinking about assessment, is you think about aligning learning across multiple levels of increasingly formal representations of your knowledge that you're assessing. So these 10, and I'm a design-based researcher. All of my work has been, I originally had these, a 3-level model. I added the 4th level, and frankly, my broader pedagogy was really shaped by some mid-career mentoring from Jim G, who gave me 2 pieces of really important advice about 10 years ago. One was to get a theory of talk, and the other one was to find a way to explain my model that's a lot simpler than I had been doing. It's like, I think this is a great idea. If you guys know Jim G, he's a real gruff guy. He's like, but it took me a year to figure out what the hell you were talking about. You just need to find a way to simplify this stuff. And so what I'm showing you today, these papers are really a culmination of doing that, of in particular, what I've been doing and what my lab has been doing in the past 2 years has been taking these theory-laden design principles and translating them into steps. We have one paper in information learning and information sciences, information and learning sciences, that is the most straightforward thing I've ever written. It was a pandemic emergency response piece. There's almost no theory, and they're literally just steps with examples taken from our collaborating teachers. So what I'm hoping to do in this talk is to show you how this is manifested in one class. Tripp and Morgan took this class in the summer, and we've got some examples. So let me stop there. Are there any questions in the chat that need to be answered before we dive into, I take over the screen?
I think we're doing good, Dan.
All right, let me share. Okay. That was not what I was expecting. Okay, so first I'd like to acknowledge my awesome graduate students and collaborators. Suraj is currently a postdoc with us. Rebecca Ito is the principal of Indiana University High School, who implemented a version of this work at IUHS and then as her dissertation and became the principal. And we're implementing a lot of these ideas in a really great collaboration. Grant is with us today. Chris is finishing up his dissertation, looking at a massive use of social annotation in all of our freshman composition classes across the university. Big shout out to Mike Beam, Assistant VP for School Partnerships, formerly IUHS Principal. Stacy Maroney has funded a bunch of this work through the OVPIT. She's currently the Dean of our school and is awesome. So the example context is this is assessment in schools. I just changed the name to assessment and learning because because it's a broader course. I've been teaching this course since 2005, online since 2009. We got a grant from Google to teach this as what I call a MOOC to hundreds, not thousands of open learners. Learned that this approach really does scale, and it made it possible for me to teach, literally have hundreds of open learners engaging deeply in earning digital credentials without requiring any of my time. I teach this during the summer, and I'm really busy. Frankly, I travel a lot when I teach this course. I don't tell my students, but I'm often out bike packing in Europe, or, sometimes, one summer, on a satellite phone in a refugio in the Alps, or satellite uplink. So really have been working hard to make it possible. I do put in a lot of time when I have it, but if I'm busy and I can't make it to class, like literally, I might not make it to class for a whole week. It's not a problem. Students don't even realize I'm not there. So they're learning the language of assessment. This model that I'll show you today has been used in a wide range of secondary. We now have 40 high school courses. It's been used in undergrad ed, psych, graduate courses of mine and adjuncts I supervise, for courses for K-12 network administrators, as well as open and conventional contexts. So I'm going to return to this slide a lot. I literally just made it today. I was inspired by one that Elizabeth created, but I realized this one will help me make a bunch of points. So those are these 4 levels. So that the top one, right, that knowledge is very informal, and it's a time scale of hours. I wonder how many of you are familiar with Jay Lemke's MCA article on timescales of learning. It's very important, very central to situative theory, is recognizing that different forms of learning take place over different timescales. In my experience working with cognitive assessment people, this is one of the hardest things for them to wrap their head around. Cognitive perspectives have a fairly monolithic perspective of learning, especially sort of constructivist perspectives. So I will be returning to this, but what this allows you to do is at the second level, you'll see weekly close summative assessments of prior engagement and formative assessments of understanding. So one of my principles is, if you, rather than adopting assessment purposes as Pellegrino, knowing what students know, what influential NRC report, they talk about formative, summative, and evaluative purposes. Instead, I talk about functions, because that allows you to assign one assessment formative functions for one kind of learning and summative functions for another kind of learning. In my experience at assessment conferences, this is one of the ideas that just leaves Heidi Andrade. It just was like, what are you talking about? I'll never forget the look on her face. She just could not, so that's, and if you, it's very difficult to wrap your head around that without embracing a situative perspective. But let me show you what it looks like in practice. So this is a class on making assessments, and partway in is about learning to create good short answer items. And we use Popham's textbook. It's a very, very good textbook. It has very good guidelines, and they're going to learn to apply these guidelines. And so this is probably the third week. At the beginning of the class, students generate a curricular aim that embodies their interests and goals and context, and then they revisit that curricular aim each week. This is embracing Randy Engel's notion of expansive framing, that you really want people to problematize content from their own perspectives. So there you see her aim. She went through and there's the item she created. Then I do something that, and this again draws directly from Randy Engel's notion. This is how I've embodied her notion of expansive framing. The assignment tells students to use these guidelines to create short answer items for your instructional goal, and then rank those items and summarize them in order of relevance to you, and only you, not in general. So she said that that first guideline was most relevant because it can foster the item to be less ambiguous, given the majority of the students. Right? So she really connected the guideline to her context. And then if you look at the last one, this is least relevant, right? So she's making very strong connections here between her task and the guidelines. It's very difficult to fake it. You can't write this stuff. I want you to notice the sort of informal, this is very informal writing. There's no grading of the writing. We're not teaching people to write here. We're engaging with these ideas. So the first this first level in my model is this threaded discussion on student artifacts. So we get it. So all of the discussion takes place on student artifacts. There's no discussion forum here, right? Discussion forums, avoid them at all costs. Only use them for very specialized purpose. Don't have substantive discussions in them, because the conversations go off in many different directions. Whereas if students are interacting with each other and the instructor on their work, those interactions are anchored to that work. So there's only one required post, and that is students are required to ask a question of their peers. And there you can see that one of the things that that Morgan did was she generated a flawed item and asked the students, so the students try to say what were the flaws. And you can see here that that's a nice, fun little interaction. Can you create a bad item, and can people identify it? My feedback is, so I spend much of my time. So Morgan's question was, how do you attain the validity and reliability of an essay test? And I point out to her, great question. We're going to get to that. But I want you to see something I'm doing here that's really important. And that is that I'm introducing more advanced concepts or setting up concepts for later discussion. So I spend most of my time and my 20 years of experience teaching this, really moving the conversation forward, in particular, introducing concepts that if I had embedded them in the assignment would have overwhelmed the students because they weren't ready for it. So I give them a little hint here and say, people always refer to assessments as valid, but none of you should after completing this class. Validity is a property of evidence in relation to an argument. In fact, you will learn that if someone refers to an assessment as valid, it's a telltale sign that they have little expertise in assessment. And you notice that got a couple of likes. So this is this first level of assessment. This is very informal. What I'm really doing here is just assessing the discourse and moving the conversation forward. Now, this learning is happening at very, very short time scales. Now, because it's asynchronous, it actually happens over the span of a week. But the time scale of the learning that is occurring here is very brief. It's very short stuff, and it's all very informal. So let me see if there's anything else. So to reiterate, so that's continuous immediate level assessment of student discourse by the instructor comments, learnings at a very informal, very short time scale. So let me stop here and ask Sueli, Corey, and Selma to speculate about whether this, actually, let me, before I do that, Morgan, I want you to say a little bit about how you experience that feedback as a student. Like, for instance, do you think that, are you reading stuff that I write on? How much stuff do you think that I'm putting on other people's posts do you end up seeing?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we have like a week to comment on each other's post. So usually I will spend a majority of the first half of my week just to like look through other people's posts as well as the discussion thread underneath their original post and see if there are like any comments or feedbacks that I can add on. And sometimes I can definitely see Professor Hickey's comments, and by looking through his comment and the discussion between my peers, it can sometimes help me to understand a concept better, and it can also help me to sometimes see like perspective from their like their context.
So Corey, Sueli, and Selma, my intention was to just sort of turn it over to you guys, you folks, and see what your thoughts are and see whether there's any, whether you're doing anything similar to this. Like, how much time do you spend assessing discourse in the online classes?
Well, one thing I'd say, like, I don't teach, I mean, when I was teaching courses online, I would still do a lot of you know, this kind of work live in person in class. Like I haven't done it kind of asynchronously. So I guess the closest thing that I can think of is when I've done, I guess, like what we might call like a gallery walk, where, you know, you have, especially when I'm trying to get students to kind of look at work they're doing, and I try to find different examples of students' work, and so that we're able to kind of move around together and give feedback, and the students are giving each other feedback, trying to look for areas where they have questions, or they've noticed things that students are missing, or opportunities that, you know, opportunities that they've missed. So I'm still doing all of this together in like our active learning classrooms, and I'm, you know, this is what I'm trying to look at, is how to create these opportunities out of class, and I'm not there yet, but I do relate to this in the class.
And when you're doing the full class discussion, do you think of what you're doing as assessment? Do you feel you're assessing informally, assessing discourse, and that this very short time, this brief time scale learning, like literally people are changing their tone, they're adopting new language on the fly, and you're—
For sure. Someone brought this up in the chat, but you know, the borders of what we call assessment for me are quite fluid. So for me, a discussion in class, presenting our concept, but as soon as we get into a discussion where there's a back and forth between students, or you know, I feel like that becomes assessment, right? Where we're even just checking in about our understanding, or testing, you know, like, oh, I heard this happened, I saw this YouTube video and it makes me think of it. Like, I feel like that's a live kind of assessment. It's like, am I right to feel like there's a connection? So I feel like assessment's happening all the time. Like, and that is for me the teaching. So, and I thrive on that in person. And it's like, you know, how I'm curious to see how you're, and a lot of other teachers are creating that kind of learning outside of class online.
How about you, Selma? I mean, this is the thing that your experience makes you really good at, right? This is what we're being paid to deliver, and this is what most of us are probably better at than almost anybody we know in the contexts we do it.
Yeah, pretty much like Corey, I too believe that, or I'm starting more and more to believe that assessment is a fluid concept, that there are no boundaries. So a discussion in class is a form of assessment. Through my online teaching experiences, what I found was useful is as Morgan was saying, is that accessibility to public feedback. I can't remember who said it in the chat, but it was a way of a survival strategy during when we were heavily loaded with all the things happening in the online world and during the pandemic. So I found that kind of public feedback, so maximizing or optimizing my time to provide more general feedback was something that was beneficial for the students, because they could go back and see it, and it was low stakes, so there is no threat to their egos, like pointing the fingers, you didn't do this right, in individual that individual feedback has. But I feel like it also fosters intrinsic motivation to learn, because the students are seeing the public feedback, they're seeing the good points, and you know, the feedback in general, and then they can thrive. Hopefully, that's the idea, is that they can thrive to perform better, because it's low stakes, it's not threatening, but it's also giving them a chance to feel ownership of their work and feel and get positive feedback. I don't know if it's doing so. Honestly, I've not assessed the assessment process, but I feel like the two are inseparable. That if you want to provide good feedback, you also have to foster like the will to use it, or the motivation to use the feedback.
Yeah, two things that really inspired me here. One was working with the media scholar Henry Jenkins on my first MacArthur grant, and he has a notion of a participatory culture, and that is a place where no one is required to contribute, but knows that when they do contribute, their contributions will be valued. So I never require a set number of comments. If people don't interact in this discussion space, there are virtually no consequences. If they don't ask a question and they're clearly slacking off, I might give them an A- or something when I grade their post. But so we're really trying to create a space where nobody speaks for the sake of speaking and getting a grade, and where all the contributions are valued. The other big inspiration here is Randy Engel's expansive framing, which you're insistently positioning Randy's work was all face-to-face, and it was about positioning students as authors of new knowledge, new disciplinary knowledge. And I take that a step further, and I position students as audience as well for the insights authored by their classmates. And so I've gotten pretty good at making that happen. I think, I get dozens of threaded comments without requiring them. And I assure you, if we look deeply at the content, you'd see it's pretty deep. I mean, it gets deep fast, but it's anchored to the artifacts. And so it doesn't go off in these abstractions where the two people who already understand the concept go way off on some hellhole in the discussion forum and lose all the other students. So, okay, are there questions in the chat before we move on to the next level?
I think there's some nice conversation that's happening, but I think people are building off of what you're saying, Dan. So maybe you can get to the next level and there'll be some more questions.
Okay. So at the end of each assignment, there's this reflection prompt. So this is, to reiterate, this is the close level summative assessment of prior engagement, but a formative assessment of their understanding via informal reflection. So that reflect every week after they, this is due the week after the assignment. They've had a week to discuss and come back. And these are very carefully structured. The very first one, the core of this was inspired by Melissa Grisolfi's notion of consequential engagement, right? So did your classmates have an aim and a context better suited to engaging with these ideas? The math educator who goes, no, my portfolio assessment just doesn't make any sense. I'm not going to use portfolio assessment. But boy, those English teachers really knocked it out of the park, right? So right now in my P540 class, I'm letting the students in school psych learn about learning and cognition using goals in school psych. One of them's using social skills. Another one's using vision imagery in sports psychology, and it's just not working. But the only reason it's not working is because she understands transfer now a lot better than she did before, and it's really hard to apply cognitive models of transfer. So learning that you can't apply something is just as important as applying it, as being able to apply it. So that's this contextual collaborative engagement. Be specific, name the people that they contributed, what was helpful. Consequential engagement, what will you do differently in the future, having learned the ideas in the assignment. Conceptual engagement, now this is going to confuse people because there's a little logistic flip here, because the self-assessment at level 3 is actually completed before the reflection at level 2, but it's just a little check. Did you understand the concepts? It's a little motivator there to further get them to reflect. Cultural engagement, I won't talk about this time. I'll talk about this a lot in 2 weeks, because the cultural engagement is a centerpiece of our efforts to help reposition minoritized students in their reflections. But, how did personal factors affect this? I'll talk about this a lot next week. So those are the prompts. And Morgan, right, so before I ask Morgan to comment on this reflection, I'm going to point out, this is a summative assessment of their prior engagement. You can't fake this. You can't make this stuff up, right? With that, I'm comfortable awarding 70% of the points in class, 5 points across, the 70% are the points that I award them, as long as these reflections are coherent and as long as they completed the assignment, they get all their points. So my private interaction in the grade book usually consists of great job, see my new comments. And I will cut and paste that. I might, if they say something particular in the reflection that's inspiring, I might let them know that I'm reading their reflections. But this is also a formative assessment of their understanding. If you look through here, you can see that she's really revisiting some of the concepts. There's some modest accountability for the collaboration. People like to see each other's name get named in this way. So Morgan, let me ask you to comment on this process from your perspective and say a little bit more about, for instance, do you put on your BS detectors and say, I claim that these shape engagement proleptically, because the first time they write this, they know that they're going to have to write it the next time. And so they're thinking about their engagement in this way, in part so that it's easier to write these reflections, but in part because that's what they're sort of training to do. Prolepsis is the way that the future shapes the present. So Morgan, you want to say a bit about this?
Sure, yeah. I personally really enjoy the reflection part of the assignment, and I think it truly benefited me a lot. So, for example, every time when I write about the contextual and conceptual engagement, it really helped me to reflect and rethink on the knowledge that I obtained in the lesson, and if there were any key concept that I still need to revisit based on the self-assessment. And in particular, it really helped me to reflect on what I have known before, what is newly learned, and how to implement this knowledge that I learned in this course in my future studies or teaching. And for the consequential engagement, it is also something that I find really unique about this course, because with my past experience of writing reflections for other courses, it rarely asked me to reflect on whether if I will use the knowledge that I learned in this course in my future studies or teaching, and in what ways will I make changes based on what I learned from this course. So I personally find this section really helpful, and it really gave me the time to think about what should be improved in my future teaching, and if I did anything wrong in the past, I need to change according to what I've learned. And the collaborative and the cultural engagement is something that I really look forward to write about each week, because as the previous slide shows, we only required to post like one question each week, but we do get a lot of like comments, great comments from my peers. So regarding about like either question that I post or about the content that I wrote in my post. So it is really great experience to interact with my peers, especially in an online class. And I personally have also benefited a lot by reading my peers' post, because a lot of my teaching experience that I mentioned in my assignment were teaching Chinese students. So I have like different perspective and different size from my peers, because most of them work in the K through 12 setting. So it is really beneficial for me to look what their perspectives are and what their concerns are and how they usually teach in their classrooms.
Awesome, thanks. So, Selma, Corey, what do you guys think? Would you, could you?
Yeah, Selma actually already had to leave us, unfortunately. So, but I'm here, and we have lots of. I'm sure we also have lots of teachers who are chiming in the chat. But I before I kind of jump in, I had a clarification question. Sorry if I missed it, but to what extent are these students' reflections? Are these always private, or are they always public? Or
Funny you should ask. In P507, they were public. In P540, which I'm teaching this semester for really logistical reasons, they're private and they're submitted in the submission window. Morgan, my sense is that students don't pay that much attention to other people's reflections. They're posted typically at the end. Is that true?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So so because the reflection was posted like 1 week later, so we don't really pay as much attention to each other's reflections.
Yeah, this is interesting. Chip, did we? Yeah, one of the principles that I'll come back to if I have time. Oh shoot, Vanderbilt, what's his name? 3 little notches in there. Oh God, I can't believe I'm drawing a blank on his name. He's such an inspiration. Anyways, he taught me the distinction between 3 kinds of interaction: public, local, and private. Right, and the distinction between public and local is really important. Public is where you're writing to the audience, right? So when you're posting, when Morgan's writing her reflection, that's really a local interaction. She's really writing that to me. And my comments to her might be written to her, but when she's writing her Wikifolio or writing her, completing her assignment each week, that's really public interaction. It's meant to be for public consumption. And that's really crucial. If you want to position people as authors rather than consumers, you really want them to be, in a sense, that they're really writing to public. And then to this private interaction, I've added a 4th category of discrete interaction. So really, that's what I call the interaction inside of a quiz. Is like that's different than private interaction. Let's downplay it from local, and I'll come back to that in a bit. Corey, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, before I do, a quick question that's helping, or just to confirm, we have people in the chat just asking, what level are your students?
These are graduate students. So these are mostly first-year graduate students, mostly teacher ed students, a lot of administrators. But I will point out that one of the things that's really important in my classes is that I have a vast range of ambitions and experience. You know, I'll have a teacher in art ed who just needs one more class to get her who's already teaching and needs one more class to get her master's degree. We don't even give a salary increase for a master's degree anymore. You know, to having my advisees first semester who really need to learn this stuff deeply. So that's one of the things. We have used this very successfully with high school. They are able to, and as well as undergraduates. I will say that some of these things definitely need to be modified for high school students. But yeah, we've got now 40 brand new. We got $2 million from the CARES Act to create 40 new courses using this framework. Pardon me. Any other questions?
I'm not seeing any other questions. I would just, yeah, I would just say one interesting element in here too. So on my end, I definitely relate to these kinds of reflections. I've called them exploration journals. I've called that, you know, I want students to think about takeaways. But what I'm really appreciating, there's some levels here that I do at different points, but I'm interested in the kind of routine aspect of it, or the ritual aspect of this kind of reflection, and that you're getting students to kind of build up this ability over time to think on these different levels. But one thing that I sometimes do, and I'm imagining, is as a teacher also doing these reflections, you know, from my role as a teacher facilitator in the classroom, being able to kind of also do these reflections and sharing them with students on my experience going through the course. Because I really feel in my classes, like the students' lives or experiences, what their interests are, really shape the direction of the course. Like I'm providing kind of some framework, some concepts. But so yeah, I think, you know, and have you had experience with teachers also playing a role in modeling that reflection as well? Or do you think that kind of maybe steers the ship too much?
Say a little more.
Well, yeah, I guess like sometimes, you know, when I ask students to kind of reflect on things that we've been doing, activities we've done, or assignments, I don't necessarily use this language, but I can relate to a lot of these, the kind of questions that are coming up in these reflections. But sometimes I actually, you know, instead of just asking the students to do it, I also will do that reflection as well. And
Yeah,
I think part
yeah.
of it is I like to, you know, remind students that I'm not just waiting for them at the end where all the, you know, with all this knowledge, but that I'm also constantly learning and reflecting as well along the way. And I'm just curious if that's part of the practice as well.
I'm glad you asked that question. I should point out, okay, so I have a huge pet peeve, and the pandemic really drove it home, was that a lot of instructional design professionals advise people to make content. And I think that's just a terrible idea. It's so much work to make videos, for example, and there's so much OER out there. I will add, though, that I did create videos for this class, but in those videos, I do not deliver content. I model the engagement. So in my videos, I say, we're going to learn about short answer items. Here's how I use short answer items in this class. And this is why I do that. So I don't reiterate the content. Instead, I just model the kind of engagement that I'm looking for in my students in my own course. Now, that's a little easy because I can talk about assessments in a course on assessment. But in the courses that we created for K-12 network administrators, it was really, the content experts kept wanting to create these excruciatingly dense videos of content that were impossible to understand. And I finally just said, no, this is not working. Let me interview you. How do you use packet tracing on your job? What was hard for you to learn packet tracing on your job? Oh, Juan, you're in school right now. Are you learning about packet tracing? You know, so I just, you know, how do you use these concepts? So rather than deliver, if you're going to create content that models the kinds of engagement that you want from your students wherever possible.
Michael, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just have a little question on the nature of the assessment. I mean, I think you mentioned that the reflections form a big part of the grades, and I'm always hesitant to bring up the grading and that, but in the context of competency-based assessment, right? The mark I'm supposed to give at the end of the semester I teach physics, by the way. The mark I'm supposed to give at the end of the semester, like there's no category to put things like the student has been reflective, student has been, like, these are all sorts of things that one would hope lead them to get a better development of the competency. But I'm just wondering if there's a tension sort of there between these sorts of competency-based grades.
Oh, it's a massive one. Given thanks to MacArthur, I was front and center in digital badges. I was on board with digital badges before digital badges existed because of my work with MacArthur. The badges that you earned in my big open online course version of this, the first competency was discuss these concepts with your professional peers. And the badge linked to the threaded discussions. So now I have, it said, you know, it said the competency was discuss these concepts with your professional peers as evidenced by the threaded discussions inside of this badge, linked in the badge. But I also included the competency able to recognize more and less appropriate versions of each of these item types. So I still am in the competency-based space, but I treat the more conventional competencies as sort of cognitive residue of the discursive engagement.
Yeah, I'm hearing what you're saying. I don't get a choice. I don't get to define the competencies, though. That's sort of my difficulty here, that students will solve problems using Newton's third law, but doesn't.
I would, yeah, and that's why let me come back to that when I show you my final exam.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on then. Okay, so to reiterate, so now shifting to level 3. So moving more into the concern that you're expressing, Michael, now we're getting into knowledge that's more formally represented. It's semi-formal, it's short, and these are self-assessments that are summative of their understanding, of their conceptual understanding, but formative of their achievement. Conceptual understanding is different than achievement. Conceptual understanding is in a construct. Achievement is a construct. You can have a construct of your knowledge, your achievement of physics, your achievement of these topics, typically is represented by a very formal summative exam. Now you're really capturing learning that's accruing over a time scale of around weeks, right? Over, you know, we're talking about an exam at the end, right? So in this case, at the end of each assignment, after completing, but before reflecting, right? So there's a little switch here that's probably confusing, but yeah, I think people can appreciate why I do this. So it says, so there's this self-check. I am not involved in this at all. I spend no time giving feedback. I spend a lot of time creating these so that I feel that they're effective. But I tell students, you must write something before you can see the expert response. You should search for information on the web if you don't know what to write, but you really should be able to answer these questions if you engaged, right? I've done a lot of my work as in situative theories of motivation. I'm a firm believer in incentives. I want students to know that if they do this, first of all, they should be able to answer these questions. If they don't, they really need to carefully read the expert answers and engage wherever they can. And there's a big opportunity to learn here. So here's an example of a self-assessment. Now, this is one that I literally just made this slide today, so I'm really going to be putting Trip on the spot here. What is this item's primary shortcoming? Like I said, one of the formal competencies is that you can recognize more or less well constructed. And that's, I think, Michael, that's probably consistent. You can recognize more appropriate and less appropriate solutions to a physics problem, for example, would fit within your space. Now, because of this particular assignment, I decided to stick with a short answer. It was really easy to do these questions. So there's Tripp's response that he wrote in the thing. He doesn't get to see the expert answer until he writes something. I'm not monitoring this on a day-to-day basis. I'm not giving them any points if they do or don't. If these were undergraduates, I think you might want to. I'm looking to make sure that I'm motivating them to write coherent answers. And I'm checking in with my students, especially my advisees, to see, you know, you actually didn't, you missed that. So Trip, let me ask you to comment on do you remember this one?
Yeah, well, it was brought to my memory by looking at the slides earlier today, but Yeah, so I see that the double concept here, right, Dan, would be validity and reliability kind of crammed into one item. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I maintain that the syntax is a little convoluted, but I think I approached this as a fairly informal but slightly more formal formative assessment, and I think actually this was a week after I was engaging with this content too. Since Dan, if I'm correct, this was an element that was due before the next assignment rather than at the due date.
That's right. Yeah. So typically you'd be returning to it. You probably already started on the next assignment, but you needed to get the reflections in, or before you started the next assignment, you did your reflections. But I would contend that this is, for me, no labor at all for the students, not a huge amount of labor, but a little reminder. Yeah, the syntax is convoluted, but the reason it was convoluted is because it was actually assessing two concepts. Many of them have a much longer, many of them are more like essay items. And so they ask for, this is a recognition level item, a fairly lower level item, but you really need, a little reminder. On the essay items, the expert feedback tends to be much longer. My theory of action here is that at this moment, a student is really primed to read a detailed explanation of something that they worked on, especially if it's something that they literally just maybe searched on the web, maybe went back to the textbook, maybe looked at their assignment. They're really primed to read a formal description, somewhat abstracted from the context. What I mean by that's semi-formal, it's open-ended. Now, I do look at the answers. I do look and see what students have written. Typically, at the end of the semester, I'll go in and scan it and see. If a student is struggling, I might check and see if they're doing the self-assessments and remind them to do them. I've elected not to make them points. Again, I can see with undergraduates and high school students, you may well want to also assign completion points for completing that because that's the way those students are. Okay, so before we move on, let me stop. Corey, Michael, what do you think? Michael, are you buying this?
Yeah, I mean, be honest with you, I've intuitively tripped on some very similar scripts, and that I guess the principal difference is in terms of what I'm able to allocate those. All of these things together can amount to 10% of their grade. And I was just asking sort of about the nature of I've enjoyed doing this, and I think the students have benefited from having, I do ask the reflection questions after a little bit of self-assessment, and that as part of a script, and I'm using social annotation platforms and joining the discussion groups. I guess the point I was a little bit concerned about, just in terms of grades and that, and and it's a different context that you're in, and you're able to make the competencies that are going to be assessed at a high at a high percentage fraction, whatever, really speak to these tasks that they're doing, whereas there's a little bit of a disconnect and I was just wondering about the tension, but you've spoken to that, so thank you very much.
No, I will say two things. I have a blog post from up, and my blog is Remediating Assessment. We got a faculty resubmission grant, and I try to pilot some of this stuff with math in finite mathematics, and I didn't get very far. I just the instructors just thought I was out of my mind. I've failed miserably in mathematics every time I've tried, but this is working very nicely in the high school biology class. We now have 10 STEM courses created with versions of this, a little less focused on assessment, but case in point, I got a similar argument from the English teacher, Rebecca, when she was doing her dissertation as a research practice partnership before she became the principal of IUHS. We said that at least 50% of the grades, the high school grades, needed to be based on the reflections. And she said, no way, that's never going to work. She was raising the same concerns. She said, I'm going to make it 70%. just to prove you wrong. And it turns out that if you make the exams tough enough, that students are going to get a low grade if they don't do well on them. You know, it's working. But I think that I definitely can see absolutely this would need to be adjusted dramatically to address the concerns that you're raising. To me, the proof is in the pudding. If you can get the performance on the kinds of exams that you probably have in your classes, that's what we're after. That's what I mean when I say discrete. Make your tests discrete. Don't teach to them. I mean, the real issue that I see in STEM classes is that so much of the lectures are basically preparing, you know, instructors use the negative stems in their exams as counter examples in their lectures. And then, you know, in Physics 102, they're saying, what did you teach these people? Well, they got A's. It's because they were too much teaching to the test. They weren't varying the forms of the representations of knowledge from the lecture to the test. Tripp and Morgan, do you want to add anything? I don't have a, I decided to go with just one. Or Corey, do we have questions?
No, we just have comments coming up. I guess one thing I might just highlight, because I think it's also disciplinary, because I don't really use tests in my class. And so one thing I'm noticing in this conversation for me is that the boundary between a reflection, a self-assessment, and a summative assessment are really blurry, because I actually find a lot of my summative assessments are in fact, they're actually called critical reflections, right? I teach in humanities and sociology. So even those smaller kind of activities of the reflections are essentially the skills that I'm trying to develop and become the summative assessment. Like your ability to reflect on material and concepts and conversations and your own experience across multiple levels while engaging with the material. So anyways, it's just interesting for me to kind of track that, is that the lines between these levels feel blurry for me. And so at the end of the semester for me, I have students doing writing, and it's often like critical thinking and reflection. And I think there are quite a few teachers here who probably relate to that as well. So in terms of weighting, and you know, in terms of the grades that are assigned, I'd have to unpack that first before I could speak to where I'm kind of weighting different types of assessments.
Yeah, I think that in many settings there is enough formal, discrete knowledge that when people are doing portfolio assessment, for example, you know, people can come to a very similar quality portfolio through very different means. If someone hands in a work sample, it gets a perfect score. Well, that's very different than someone who's working for an adjunct instructor whose job is based on both the quality of those artifacts and the student evaluations. And those students demand and receive extensive individualized feedback on that artifact. That portfolio, that student doesn't know as much as the student who just happened to have already done that quality work. So it's very difficult at times to make valid judgments about what people know based on what they did. So I encourage people doing portfolio assessment, say, let's just make sure that they're learning this stuff. Have a little quick and dirty, secure, multiple choice exam that's not worth very many points, and make sure that they're really learning this stuff, and remind them and remind yourself that there are some fundamental concepts that people should be taking away if they want to be prepared for future learning and using those ideas in context. Okay, I'm watching the time, so I think I should probably go ahead and wrap up here with the last level. Grant, did you want to say something?
I'm okay. I'm sorry. I was digging up a chapter for Dr. Charles.
Okay. And thank you, Grant. But and it was Rogers Hall who was the one who inspired our levels of interaction. So, okay. So finally, we're moving on. So this is probably the most controversial. As a situative theorist, I believe that quizzes, you know, a multiple choice test, it's a bizarre form of disciplinary discourse. but nonetheless one that can serve very important and sometimes unique functions. If you want to compare learning across two different classes, it's really hard to do that looking at the artifacts student generated because of the massive amounts of variance that you see. And if you want to compare how much people know about a given discipline and do that efficiently and reliably and have evidence that is convincing that this person knows a little bit more than this person, it's really difficult to do that without a multiple choice test. It's very difficult. Good performance assessments can do it, but those are pretty hard to develop and they're really time consuming. So just have a distal summative automated assessment where it's appropriate, where you think it belongs. Now, doing this online can be difficult for a bunch of reasons that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So this is an example. This is actually a pretty difficult item. It's a so-called best answer item. It's some of these could be correct. Now, the important thing is my exams are time limited. Notice there's 20 items and you have 40 minutes to complete it for test security. You'll only see one item at a time and you will not be shown the correct answer. So I keep my tests secure so that they can't print them all out and share them with each other. Someone can't, they could if they really wanted to, but each quiz is only worth 10% of their grade. And I make sure that I've really motivated them to be prepared for it. This is an item from an item bank, but it's been completely rewritten because most items from item banks are completely compromised and they end up in Chegg. Most people aren't aware, but the test publishers license their content in their item banks to homework help sites. And if you take an item from an item bank and enter the STEM, it's going to be the first hit, as I'll show you. So here's one of the items from my quiz. You can see here that Google is trying to answer it. There's the STEM. Now you also have to make sure that both the STEM and the answers, right? So you have to reword both parts of the quiz to keep these from being searchable. So you can see it's getting close, but in 2 minutes, a student who hasn't been prepared probably couldn't dig it up. Now, the thing that a lot of people don't realize is that people also ask. Students learn to look there for the answers to their questions. So you just have to make sure that they're not. So here you can see that item. This is what I meant by asking about how many people use item analysis. This is a simple discrimination index. This basically compares the score of the people who got the highest half of the score overall versus the students in the bottom half of that distribution. And that's a very high D, 0.55. They don't get much higher than that. But the point is the 7 people who chose those other 2 responses did much worse overall on the test than the 9 students who got it correct. And so you shouldn't have any items, for instance, with a negative D. They should all be positive. So this year I reworked my exam. I completely reworked it because it had been compromised. And I added extra items and I went in and I eliminated the items that were like this one, too difficult, right? It has a negative D. So the people who got that item right did much worse overall on the exam than the people who got it correct. And it's impossibly difficult. So boom, it was gone. So I removed it. It didn't count towards students' grades and I'm left with an exam that's fairly short, but also I will say that I make sure that I have enough right. So this item was 56% only got it correct. So I make sure that my exams have about 80%, but that no more than one student, if any, gets every item correct. So I make sure that whatever's going on, these things are hard, the items discriminate well. And so because of all of this automation in the formative and summative assessment, right, I don't touch those during the class. I'm spending all of my time doing what I think I'm really well qualified to do, which is engaging in public with my students, moving the discourse along, and in particular, very carefully inserting more advanced concepts in those threaded discussions and in my announcements. After each week, I'll post an announcement when I assign grades. There are some really good examples of stuff. So I'll post an announcement and say, hey, if you're still struggling with this idea, go check out this thread that happened over here. There's a really good discussion of this concept that I really think many of you can benefit from. And that's it. That was my talk, and now I want to open it up to the floor for more discussion.
Great, thanks. And we're
Maybe
we're
go
getting
back to the principles slide.
yes.
I'm going to yield to you.
Okay. So we're going to invite people who, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand, or you can ask a question in the chat. But Liz, you also, I just want to check in with Liz as well. You were talking about a slide with questions.
No, I was, if you go forward, there were a couple of points that were made early on, and I'm
Okay.
not sure if they are as relevant now
Okay.
as they were on the way. But I do have a question. No, first off, Dan, thank you. This is great, and I love all of the provocative statements and the food for thought. What I was questioning is, I agree that these multiple choice questions, while they are not the kind of discourse that comes from the discipline, but they're really assessments of, can I compare, this apple to this apple? I love that question that it provokes, and I'm looking at the participant lists here, who are on, who's still listening, and I'm seeing people, like Tamara Weston from McGill Biology, who probably uses multiple choice questions a lot, and I'm thinking about my colleagues from the colleges, Chris Gregg and Jason Lapointe, who teach biology as well, along with Tamara, and asking, how do we make good questions though?
I encourage people to start with the item bank items and rewrite them. It's really hard to make good items, but you really need to make best answer items rather than correct answer items, where you're asking students to make a judgment between 2 or 3 possible plausible answers. And that's what professional item writers do. That's why the SAT and the GRE are so incredibly reliable, because, and they really do get at deeper thinking. You can't memorize those. They're not getting at memorization. Some of them are, but you want to include some of these items. So you can learn how to do it. I would recommend people getting their hands on Popham's textbook and using his chapter. There's cheap used versions abound. The guidelines haven't changed, and the old versions are, $4 or $5. You can learn. You need to know your discipline well. And you need to practice. I would say, though, looking at professionally designed items in your discipline is a really good way to learn. The process of rewriting them, rewriting the text, the publisher's ones. I mean, they hire professionals to write those items. And professional, I have friends who literally are professional item writers. That's what they do for a living. They do it for the textbooks and they do it for the test publishers. And they're really good at making items that really consistently differentiate between people who really understand a concept deeply and the people whose understanding is more shallow. And the discussions about equity, we're going to talk about that in 2 weeks. The whole issue about equity, I encourage everyone to look at the work of Jennifer Randall. She has convinced me that that race-neutral assessments are actually biased towards white men. And we'll talk about that a lot in 2 weeks. I'm really excited about that direction in the work.
Michael has a question. We are closing up, and since I'm not seeing any burning question besides follow-up, maybe we could close with Michael's comment question, and then we'll bring it to Liz to wrap up.
Well, thank you. And this is sort of a big picture sort of question on this. So the title of the talk, and I read the paper before, and it's about online assessment, and but a lot of the discussion today is sort of seemed to be more general, and I was just wondering if there are any how can I put it, dangers of overgeneralizing to other sort of contexts, like in classroom, or as a teacher, will I, if I adopt these principles and sort of apply them in a live classroom rather than an online context, are there any particular places that I might be setting myself up for trouble?
Gosh, it's been, I mean, because so many of the ideas emerge, I've transferred them back to my face-to-face classes, but I just don't like to teach face-to-face because I'm not very good at it. I'm not very good at fostering classroom discourse. I'm much better at fostering this kind of discourse. I mean, I think one of the concerns about face-to-face is it's much easier to unwittingly compromise your assessments by teaching to the test. I mean, I think that construct irrelevant easiness is a much bigger problem than most people appreciate it is. Again, I don't know how many times I've heard lecturers say, I don't mean this, I mean this. And students learn you see them pick up, they go, oh, that's going to be on the quiz. And sure enough, we know as cognitive scientists, we know that recognition level knowledge, you have unlimited capacity to master knowledge at the level needed to recognize associations. So don't do it. Don't give them those, don't spoon feed those associations. In fact, avoid presenting those very specific associations that will appear on your exam.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
So just to wrap up, I think the conversation could go on for a long time, which is why we have the next webinar in October the 22nd. And we want to thank you, Dan. This is fantastic. And thank your graduate students for joining us. It's wonderful to meet them and get a sense of their experience inside the classroom. And we don't do it often enough. And maybe this is a trend that you've started, is we invite students to participate. I mean, you've got graduate students, and ours are not necessarily graduate students, but we do attract university students as well to SALTISE. So maybe we can get some of those students coming and asking and participating. So this is
that's
wonderful.
Almost another principle to consider is helping students peer behind the scenes and see what's going on our end. I know that there's one clever article that I read called "What Instructors Wish Students Knew About Assessment." It was written to the students, like, look, here's what's going on our end. You probably don't see it, but so I don't know. Thank you, Tripp, Morgan, and Grant, especially for answering the questions that came up. That was really helpful. This is the first time I've done it this way, but that was pretty fun. That was fun to get their input on it, and it was really awesome for all of you to show up. And thank you. This was a huge opportunity, and I hope to meet. Liz, how much overlap is there with SALTISE and ICLS?
We're hoping to have a lot more, Dan. This is exactly the kind of our community at SALTISE is practitioners and researchers, but heavily practitioners who do research, and that's exactly what we want. In fact, I was commenting about the chat, how rich the conversation was, and the fact that it was a true example of researchers and practitioners talking, because there were citations and references being put into the conversation. So things are being backed up by theory and and ideas that have been messed around with for a bit. So we're doing something right. Yes.
Let me close with a plug.
Okay.
So we got a lovely $2 million grant from the CARES Act to expand the work that we were doing at Indiana University High School. As part of that, Grant developed the Canvas version of the course, and Tripp developed the Google version. But at IU Expand, you can Google it. There's a course called Responsive Engagement and Virtual Learner Assessment. You'll just need to get a temporary IU user ID. It's a really beautiful course that actually has people experience these kinds of engagement and assessment before trying to, and then gives them templates for developing them. And in particular, one of the things that I want to remind people is that Canvas has 10 item types, 4 quiz types, which can be used for formative versus summative purposes. That's 80 combinations. That is an overwhelming lift for many people in this world. And that's the kind of thing that we're tackling. Like, here's what it feels like to use a short answer item in the ungraded quiz in Canvas. And so they actually experience these on assessments, and then they get templates for developing them. And it was very successful. 180 teachers have completed it so far, and that was their professional development to then develop new courses using this framework. And thanks to Rebecca Ito's hard work, it worked very well. So I encourage everyone to check that out. It's IU Expand, Responsive Engagement and Virtual Learner Assessment. I'm going to put a link in there shortly to the Google Classroom course that Tripp has developed.
So, thanks for that. And thank you all. I know this has been wonderful. Truly
All right,
appreciate
awesome.
it.
Thanks for coming.
Looking forward to the next one. And for those who like to hang out, like, have a